The man who walked into Thorne Pritchett's smithy on a cold March morning did not look like someone with a secret, but he carried one all the same, wrapped up tight behind eyes the color of winter slate. "Need a lock," he said without preamble, nodding toward the rows of ironwork hanging from the forge wall. "A good one. Iron throughout, none of that cheap brass-fitting nonsense. One key only. Can you have it ready by autumn?" Thorne set down the tongs she had been using to coax a cherry glow from a horseshoe blank and studied him. She knew most faces in the village by now, even after only 3 years at the forge, but this one belonged to the edges of memory, someone glimpsed at market or passing on the road. He was tall without being remarkable about it, somewhere past 30, with the kind of build that came from work rather than war. His hands were calloused, his coat mended at the elbows, and he met her eyes without flinching, which already put him ahead of half the customers who came through her door. "Autumn," she repeated, letting the word roll around to test its weight. "That is 8 months away. You ordering this far ahead because you are particular, or because you cannot pay until harvest?" "Both." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I can put half down now, the rest when I collect." She named a price. He did not haggle, just counted out coins onto the scarred workbench exact to the copper. Thorne swept them into her palm and made a note in her ledger with a stub of charcoal. "Name, Lysander Pritchard." Her hand paused. "Pritchard, different spelling." His mouth did twitch into a smile then, brief and wry. "D instead of T at the end. No relation, I imagine, unless your people came from up country around Millbrook Ford." They did not. Thorne tapped the charcoal against the page, leaving a small mark like a fly speck. "My people came from the steading above the beck, 2 generations back, before the writ cleared it." She watched his face as she said it, the way she always did when her family's history came up, waiting for the little flicker of discomfort or the studied blankness that meant someone was working very hard not to say what they thought about orcs who had lost land, and now made horseshoes for humans who farmed it. But Lysander Pritchard only nodded, as if she had told him the forge was hot or the sky was blue. "The old Greenthorn place," he said. "Burned out, isn't it? I remember seeing the ruins as a boy. Burned, yes. After the family was moved off, someone decided to make sure of it." She kept her voice even, matter-of-fact, the way she talked about iron that had been left in the slack tub too long. "Do you want any particular style to the lock or just functional?" "Functional. It needs to keep weather out more than people." He glanced at the notes she had made. "I will come back in autumn for it. Late September, if that suits." "It suits." He left without ceremony, the door swinging shut behind him with a creak that Thorne kept meaning to oil and never did. She went back to her horseshoe, but her mind kept circling back to the lock order like a dog worrying a bone. 1 key, ready by autumn, functional rather than fancy. It was the kind of commission that came with a story attached, but Lysander Pritchard had not offered one, and she had not asked. People were entitled to their secrets, particularly when they paid in advance. Spring unfolded in the usual way, cold mornings giving way to pale sunlight and the valley greening from the bottom up. Thorne worked through her queue with steady patience, turning out hinges and nails and draw plates for the wire maker. And when the work was slow, she made things for stock, pieces she could sell at market or keep against future need. She was in the middle of forging a set of fire irons one morning in early April when her father appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on his stick. "There is someone up at Greenthorn," he said without preamble. "Saw smoke from the chimney ruins yesterday evening and again this morning." Thorne plunged the half-finished poker into the slack tub and turned, frowning. "Chimney ruins do not smoke. They are ruins. Well, these ones do." Her father lowered himself onto the stool by the door, the one she kept there for him on days when his lungs were bad. He had been a blacksmith too, before the coughing sickness took the strength from his chest, and he hated sitting idle while she worked, but pride only carried a man so far. "Thought you should know, in case it is squatters, or someone rebuilding," Thorne said slowly. The idea settled into place with the inevitability of iron cooling into shape. "I had a man in here last month ordering a lock. Lysander Pritchard. Said his name was anyway," her father grunted. "Never heard of him, nor I, but if he is rebuilding Greenthorn, he will need more than a lock." She pulled off her apron and hung it on its peg. Decision made. "I am going up there. Now, while the light is good." The path up to the old steading was overgrown but not impassable, a thread of trampled grass and exposed stones winding along the edge of the beck. Thorne followed it with her hands free and her shoulders loose, more curious than cautious. If Lysander Pritchard was up there with a hammer and nails, he was no threat. If it was someone else, well, she had her grandmother's shoulders and her own good sense, and that had been enough so far. She smelled the wood smoke before she saw the house, a clean scent of burning pine carried on the breeze. Then the steading came into view around a stand of hawthorn, and Thorne stopped in her tracks. The ruins were not ruins anymore. Or rather, they were still ruins, but someone was in the active process of changing that. New timber framed out what had once been the main cottage, the posts still raw and golden where they were not yet weathered. The chimney had been rebuilt from the ground up, stones carefully selected and stacked, and a man was crouched on the roof, hammering down lengths of slate with the focused intensity of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Lysander Pritchard, of course. She would have known that stubborn set to his shoulders anywhere. "You are going to need ridge tiles," Thorne called up. "Those slates will let the rain straight through at the peak if you do not cap them properly." He twisted around, startled, and nearly dropped his hammer. For a moment he just stared down at her, silhouetted against the spring sky, and then he laughed. It was a rusty sound, unpracticed but genuine. "Do I hire you for opinions, or do those come free with the lock?" "Free with the lock. But if you want ridge tiles, those will cost you." She came closer, tilting her head to examine the chimney. "Did you do the stonework yourself? Every piece? It has taken me a month just to get this far." He climbed down the ladder propped against the gable end, moving with the care of someone whose muscles had learned caution the hard way. Up close, he looked tired, the kind of bone-deep weariness that spoke of long days and little sleep, but there was satisfaction in it too, the quiet pride of a man who could point to a thing and say, "I made that." "What brings you up here?" "Curiosity," Thorne admitted. "My father saw smoke. We wanted to make sure it was not trouble. Just me and my trouble, which is mostly that I keep forgetting to account for the pitch of the roof when I measure." He wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving streaks of dust and lichen from the slates. "I am rebuilding the steading. Thought I would have a house by winter if I can keep the pace. Alone. She looked at the framed walls, the neat stacks of timber and stone waiting to be used, the carefully laid out foundation. It was ambitious, the kind of project that most men would hire help for or at least call in favors from neighbors. "That is a year's worth of work, not a season's. Then I will work for a year." He said it simply, as if the answer had been obvious all along. "I ordered the lock for autumn because I wanted to have the door hung by then. If it takes longer, well, the lock will keep." Thorne chewed on that for a moment, studying him. There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty that did not leave room for doubt, and she found herself liking him for it. "You will want hinges for that door, and probably a fire crane unless you plan to cook everything in a Dutch oven on the hearth." "I had not thought that far ahead," Lysander admitted. I have been focused on keeping the rain off my head. Think about it now, then. I can have hinges ready in a few weeks, strap hinges or pintles, whichever you prefer. Fire crane will take longer, but I can start on it soon if you give me the measurements. She paused, then added, and I was serious about the ridge tiles. You will thank me come the first storm. He smiled, a real one this time, and it changed his whole face, softening the hard lines of exhaustion into something warmer. I believe you. Do you make ridge tiles as well, or do I need to find a potter for those? But I can tell you who to ask. She glanced at the sun, gauging the time. I should get back. Work waiting. Of course. He walked her as far as the edge of the clearing, polite without being fussy about it. Thank you for the advice. I will think on the hinges. Thorne left him there and made her way back down the path, her mind already turning over designs for strap hinges and the best gauge of iron for a fire crane that would last. It was only when she was halfway home that she realized he had never said why he was rebuilding Greenthorn, or where he had come from, or what he planned to do with a house on a burned-out steading above the beck. She filed those questions away for next time, because she was already certain there would be a next time. Men who ordered locks 8 months in advance and rebuilt houses alone had stories worth hearing, and Thorne had always been patient about getting to the end of a good story. The weeks rolled by in a rhythm of fire and iron, and Thorne found herself climbing the path to Greenthorn more often than strictly necessary. The first time, she brought the strap hinges Lysander had commissioned, heavy iron pieces with scrolled ends that she had spent an extra hour refining, because it pleased her to make them well. The second time, she brought a fire crane and her opinion on the placement of his window openings, which he accepted with good grace, even though he had already framed 2 of them wrong. The third time, she brought nothing at all, just her hands and her eyes and an excuse about checking the pitch of the roof tiles that fooled neither of them. They fell into an easy pattern, working in parallel when Thorne visited. She would arrive to find Lysander wrestling with timber or mortar, and she would pick up whatever task was nearest and set to it without asking permission. He never protested, never told her she did not need to help. He just made room for her at the workbench or handed her a second hammer, and they worked in the kind of comfortable silence that usually took years to build. "You are good at this," he said one afternoon in late May, watching as she chiseled out a mortise in a door frame with 3 strokes where he would have needed 6. "Did you learn carpentry from your father?" "Some. Mostly I learned by watching." Thorne blew sawdust from the fresh-cut wood and tested the fit of the tenon, satisfied when it slid home with a firm snick. Blacksmithing teaches you to see how things fit together. The principles are the same, whether it is iron or timber. I wish I had your eye for it. I keep cutting things a 1/4 inch too long or too short, and then I have to do them over. He sat back on his heels, stretching the kinks from his back. I was a wheelwright before this. Good enough at my trade, but wheels are all circles and spokes. Houses are different. "Wheelwright," Thorne repeated, filing the information away. "Where?" "North of here. A town called Ashford Mill near the border marches." He picked up a plane and set to smoothing a length of oak, the blade whispering over the grain. "I worked for a man named Garvey for 8 years. Good work, steady pay, but I wanted something of my own. This was cheaper than buying a house outright." "This was free," Thorne corrected. "If you are rebuilding Greenthorn, you are doing it on cleared land. The writ means it is anyone's for the taking. Not quite anyone's. I filed a claim with the reeve." Lysander did not look up from his planing, but his voice had gone careful, the way it did when he was choosing his words. "Legal and proper. The land is mine now, or will be once the house is built, and I have worked it for a year and a day." Thorne knew the law as well as he did. Cleared land reverted to the commons after 2 generations, and anyone willing to improve it could stake a claim. It was meant to prevent good farmland from going to waste, a practical rule for practical times. But knowing the law did not make it sit any easier in her chest. This idea of Lysander building a home on the bones of what her grandmother's people had lost. She set down the chisel and looked at him. Really looked, trying to gauge what he was thinking. His face was calm, focused on his work, and she could not tell if he understood what it meant that she kept coming back here to this place, or if he thought her help was just neighborly kindness. "Does it bother you?" she asked finally. "That it was orc held before?" "No." He said it without hesitation, meeting her eyes. "Should it?" Some would say yes. Some would say I should not be helping you build on land that was taken from my blood. She kept her voice level, not accusing, just stating a fact. "But I do not know what I think yet. I am still working it out." Lysander set down the plane and gave her his full attention, which was more than most people managed when the topic turned uncomfortable. "I cannot give you back what was taken, Thorne. I do not have that power. But I can promise that what I build here will be honest work, and if you tell me to leave, I will listen." It was the right thing to say, and she appreciated him for saying it, but it did not solve the knot in her chest. "I am not telling you to leave. I am just telling you it is complicated." "Complicated I can live with," he smiled, small and wry. "I am good at complicated. It is the simple things I seem to get wrong." They went back to work after that, and the moment passed into the background hum of saw and hammer. But Thorne thought about it on the walk home, and again that night when she lay awake listening to her father's labored breathing in the next room. Greenthorn had been her grandmother's home before the clearing, a fact she knew more from her father's stories than from memory. She had been too young to remember the steading herself, just a baby when the writ came through, and the family was moved down into the village with compensation, and a forge to replace the one they had lost. It was meant to be fair, a trade of land for livelihood, and her father had never spoken of it with bitterness. But fairness was a slippery thing, and Thorne was not sure how she felt about watching Lysander build his future on the stones of her past. Summer came in hot and bright, the valley shimmering under a sky scrubbed clean of clouds. Thorne's forge became an oven, and she took to starting work before dawn and stopping at midday when the heat was too fierce to bear. In the slow hours of afternoon, she would climb the path to Greenthorn, where Lysander worked despite the sun, stripped to his shirt sleeves and browning like bread in an oven. The house was taking shape in earnest now. The walls were up, the roof sealed with proper ridge tiles that Thorne had bullied him into buying, and he had started on the interior work, framing out a loft and setting the hearthstone with painstaking care. Thorne brought him odds and ends from the forge when she visited, small things that a house needed but a man rebuilding alone might overlook. A hook for hanging pots, a trivet for the hearth, a iron hasp for the shutters to keep them from banging in the wind. He never asked her why she kept coming, and she never offered an explanation. It was easier that way, to let the thing between them grow without naming it, a friendship or something more patient and deliberate, built in increments of silence and shared work. "Hand me that level," Lysander said one afternoon in July, and Thorne passed it over without looking, her attention on the section of floorboard she was nailing down. They had developed a shorthand over the months, a way of moving around each other in the small space of the unfinished house that required no discussion. She knew where he kept his tools, and he knew which tasks she preferred and which she would do under protest. It was domestic in a way that snuck up on her, comfortable and strange at the same time. "Are you going to tell me what this house is for?" she asked, sitting back on her heels. "Or is that still a secret?" Lysander paused, the level balanced across a beam. What do you mean what it is for? It is for living in. Living alone or living with someone. He gave her a look, unreadable and quiet, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "That depends." "On what?" "On whether the someone wants to stay." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that Thorne could not quite unpack. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and went back to nailing floorboards because it was easier than trying to parse what he had just said. Lysander returned to his leveling, and they worked in silence until the sun dipped below the ridge and the light turned gold. It was late August, the fields heavy with grain and the air thick with the drowsy hum of insects, when Thorne found the stone. Lysander had asked her to help dig out the old hearth, which had settled unevenly and needed to be relevelled before he could set the fire back. She was prying up the old stones with a crowbar, working methodically from one side to the other, when she uncovered a piece that made her stop cold. The stone was sandstone, a warm gold color unusual in the local geology, and it was cut with a maker's mark in one corner. A simple design, barely more than a thumbnail-sized chip in the surface, but Thorne would have known it anywhere. It was her grandmother's mark, the same one that appeared on the lintel of the village forge, a stylized tree with roots spreading wide. She sat back on her heels, the crowbar loose in her hand, and stared at the stone. Around her, the house hummed with the echoes of the work Lysander had done. All those months of sweat and care poured into rebuilding what had been burned, and beneath it, literally beneath the hearth that would warm his home, was the proof of what had come before. Thorne. Lysander's voice came from the doorway, concerned. "What is wrong?" She picked up the stone and turned it over, showing him the mark. "This was my grandmother's. She cut it, shaped it, set it here when this was her home." Her voice came out flat, drained of inflection. "You are building your house on the foundation of hers." He crossed the room in 3 strides and crouched beside her, taking the stone gently from her hands. He studied the mark in silence, his face grave, and then he set the stone down with care and looked at her. "I did not know," he said quietly. "I swear to you I did not know. I believe you." And she did. Lysander was many things, but deceitful was not one of them. "But now you do know. So what are you going to do about it?" "I do not know," he admitted. "What do you want me to do?" Thorne shook her head, suddenly exhausted. "I do not know either. I need to think." She left him there, standing in the half-finished house with her grandmother's stone in his hands, and walked home through the gathering dusk. Her father was asleep when she arrived, which was a mercy, because she did not have words yet for what she was feeling. Anger, yes, but not at Lysander. Grief, maybe, for a loss she had never fully understood until now. And underneath it all, a bone-deep weariness at the sheer weight of history. The way the past kept reaching up to claim the present no matter how hard you tried to build something new. She did not go back to Greenthorn the next day, or the day after that. She stayed in the forge and worked through her commissions with grim determination, turning out nails and hooks and horseshoes until her arms ached and her mind went blessedly quiet. Her father asked once if she had quarreled with the Pritchard fellow, and she told him no, which was true as far as it went. You could not quarrel with someone over something that was not their fault. A week passed. Then, too, the lock Lysander had ordered was finished, sitting on a shelf in the forge wrapped in oiled cloth, waiting for September to arrive. Thorne looked at it sometimes and wondered what he was doing up at Greenthorn without her, if he was still working, or if he had given up now that the foundation of his dream had been revealed as someone else's loss. She was in the middle of drawing wire one morning in mid-September when her father shuffled into the forge, his face troubled. "There is a man from the Reeves office asking questions," he said, "about Lysander Pritchard and timber rights. Thought you should know." Thorne set down her draw plate. What kind of questions? The kind that come with accusations. Someone filed a complaint that he has been cutting wood without a permit. Her stomach dropped. Timber theft was a serious charge, the kind that could see a man fined or worse if he could not prove he had a right to the wood he was using. And Lysander had been rebuilding for months, using timber from the woods around Greenthorn. If someone wanted to cause trouble, they had just found the perfect lever. Who filed the complaint? She asked, already reaching for her coat. Woodward. A man named Hackett. Her father coughed, a wet rattling sound that made Thorne wince. You know how he is. Likes to throw his weight around, especially with newcomers. Thorne knew. Hackett was the kind of petty official who mistook authority for power and used both to make himself feel important. If he had decided Lysander was an easy target, he would not let go easily. She found Lysander at Greenthorn, standing in the yard with a man she recognized as the Reeves clerk, a nervous fellow named Osmond who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Lysander's face was carefully blank, the expression of someone who had learned to keep his thoughts to himself, but Thorne could see the tension in his shoulders. "What is this about?" she asked, directing the question at Osmond. The clerk jumped startled and clutched his ledger to his chest. "Miss Pritchett, this does not concern you. It concerns me if someone is making false accusations against my neighbor." She planted herself next to Lysander, a show of solidarity that made his mouth twitch with something that might have been gratitude. "What is the charge?" "Timber theft," Osmond said reluctantly. "Woodward Hackett claims Mr. Pritchard has been cutting wood from the commons without a permit. There is a fine of 10 shillings, or he can appear before the Reeve to dispute it." "I have a permit," Lysander said, his voice level. "I filed for timber rights when I registered the claim on the land. It is part of the improvement grant. Woodward Hackett says the permit does not cover the amount of timber you have used." Osmond flipped through his ledger, found the page he was looking for, and read aloud in a monotone. "The standard allotment for a single-room dwelling is 12 trees, no more than 8 inches in diameter. You have cleared at least twice that. Because I am not building a single-room dwelling. I am building a house with a loft and an attached outbuilding." Lysander's jaw tightened. "And I am happy to appear before the Reeve and explain that, if Hackett wants to waste everyone's time." Osmond made a note in his ledger and tucked it away. "The hearing is set for next month, 1st of October. If you can provide proof of your claim and the scope of your improvements, the charge will likely be dismissed." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "But Hackett is not known for letting things go. You should be prepared for him to fight this." After Osmond left, Thorne and Lysander stood in the yard, the nearly finished house looming behind them. It looked solid and real in the afternoon light, a testament to months of work, and the idea of it being threatened by a bureaucrat's spite made Thorne's blood boil. "This is because you are new," she said flatly. "Hackett does not like people he cannot bully, and he sees you as an outsider. He will make this as difficult as he can. I know." Lysander rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly looking as tired as he had that first day she climbed the hill. "But I have documentation. The claim, the permit, the plans I filed with the Reeve when I registered. It should be enough." "Should be is not the same as will be." Thorne crossed her arms, thinking. "You need someone to vouch for you, someone local with a reputation Hackett cannot dismiss." "And who would that be?" "I have been here less than a year. I do not have those kinds of connections." She looked at him, this stubborn man who had spent a year building a house alone on land that carried the weight of her family's history, and made a decision. "I will vouch for you." "Thorne, I will vouch for you," she repeated, brooking no argument. "I have been coming up here since spring. I have seen the work you are doing, and I can testify to the scope of it. Hackett might dismiss you as an outsider, but he cannot dismiss me. My family has been in this valley for generations." Lysander stared at her, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face. "You do not have to do this. Especially not after." He gestured vaguely at the house, at the hearth inside where her grandmother's stone still lay. "I know you have been avoiding me. I understand why." "I was not avoiding you because I blame you," Thorne said. "I was avoiding you because I needed to think. And I have thought, and here is what I know. You did not take this land from my family. You are rebuilding on it, which is not the same thing. The law says it belongs to you now, and I am not going to fight the law, but I am also not going to let Hackett use it to ruin you." "Why?" The question was quiet, almost hesitant, and it held more weight than its single syllable should have been able to carry. Thorne met his eyes and told him the truth. "Because I care what happens to you, and because this house deserves to be finished." The hearing before the Reeve was set for the 1st of October, which gave Lysander and Thorne a little over 2 weeks to prepare. They spent the time gathering documentation, organizing receipts for materials, and walking the bounds of the property to count exactly how many trees had been cut. It was tedious, exacting work, but Thorne found herself grateful for it. It gave her a reason to be at Greenthorn again, a purpose beyond the complicated tangle of feelings she had not yet sorted through. Lysander, for his part, seemed cautiously relieved to have her back. He did not push, did not ask what she had decided about the stone or the history it represented. He just worked alongside her the way he always had, steady and patient, and let the silence be comfortable again. The night before the hearing, Thorne stayed late at Greenthorn, helping Lysander organize his papers by lamplight. The house was nearly finished now, just a few small tasks left before it would be truly livable. The floor was laid, the walls chinked and plastered, and the hearth was set with a proper fireback and the crane Thorne had forged months ago. It looked like a home, she realized, not just a building. It looked like the kind of place where someone could be happy. "Are you nervous?" she asked, watching as Lysander shuffled through a stack of receipts for the 3rd time. "Terrified," he admitted. "I am not good at speaking in front of people. I always say the wrong thing or leave out something important. Then let me do the talking. I will explain the scope of the work, and you can provide the documentation when asked." She hesitated, then added, "We are in this together now. You do not have to face Hackett alone." He looked up from the receipts, and the expression on his face was so openly grateful that it made her chest ache. "Thank you, Thorne, for all of this. I know I do not say it enough, but I mean it." "You do not have to thank me," she said. "Just win the hearing and finish the house. That will be thanks enough." The Reeves Hall was a low stone building in the center of the village, smelling of damp wool and old parchment. The hearing was held in the main room, with the Reeve presiding from a chair at the head of a long table and Hackett standing to one side, looking smug and self-important in his green Woodward's coat. Lysander and Thorne sat on a bench along the wall, and a handful of villagers had turned out to watch, because a dispute over timber rights was more entertaining than most of what passed for news in the valley. The Reeve, a grizzled man named Bertram who had held the position for as long as Thorne could remember, called the hearing to order and asked Hackett to state his complaint. Hackett did so with relish, painting Lysander as a reckless newcomer who had stripped the commons of timber with no regard for the rules. He produced his own ledger, filled with tallies and estimates, and claimed that Lysander had used at least 30 trees, far beyond what his permit allowed. When it was Lysander's turn to respond, Thorne stood up instead. She laid out the facts calmly and clearly: the claim on the land, the permit for improvements, the scope of the work that had been planned and filed with the Reeves office. She brought out the receipts for purchased materials, the drawings Lysander had submitted with his claim, and her own testimony about the progress of the work. "This is not a single-room dwelling," she said, looking directly at Bertram. "It is a full house with a loft, a proper chimney, and space for an outbuilding that will serve as a workshop. The timber use is proportional to the project, and everything was done within the bounds of the permit. Woodward Hackett is either misinformed or deliberately misrepresenting the facts." Hackett's face went red. "And who are you to testify to this? You are not a surveyor or a clerk." "I am a blacksmith who has been working on the property since spring," Thorne said evenly. "I have seen every stage of the build. I know how much timber was used and for what purpose. My testimony is as valid as yours." Bertram held up a hand for silence and spent a long moment reviewing the documents Thorne had provided. Finally, he looked up and addressed Hackett. "Your complaint appears to be based on a misunderstanding of the scope of Mr. Pritchard's project. The permit he filed does allow for additional timber use, provided the work is completed within the time frame specified, which it has been." He turned to Lysander. "You are cleared of the charge. However, I expect you to submit a final accounting of materials used within the next month, for the record." Lysander nodded, relief washing over his face. "Of course, sir. Thank you." Hackett opened his mouth as if to argue, but Bertram cut him off with a sharp look. "This matter is settled. You may go." Outside the hall, Thorne and Lysander stood in the yard, the autumn sun warm on their faces. Lysander let out a long breath and then, to her surprise, laughed. "I thought we were finished," he said. "I thought Hackett was going to bury me in fines. He tried. But he underestimated how stubborn I can be." She grinned at him, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "Come on. Let us go back to Greenthorn and celebrate with whatever you have in your larder." They walked back to the steading together, and Thorne felt the last of the tension between them dissolve like frost in the morning sun. Lysander had won his hearing. The house was nearly done, and the long, strange year of building was coming to an end. She did not know what would happen next, but for the first time in months she felt ready to find out. But the matter was not settled, not quite. 3 days after the hearing, Lysander appeared at the forge with a troubled expression and a letter in his hand. "Hackett filed an appeal," he said, handing her the letter. "He is claiming that my original claim on the land is invalid because it was never properly surveyed. If he wins, I lose the property and everything I have built on it." Thorne read the letter, her jaw tightening with each line. It was bureaucratic nonsense, the kind of obstructionist tactic that someone with time and spite could use to drag out a dispute for months. But underneath the legalese, the threat was real. If Hackett could prove the claim was invalid, Lysander would have no right to the land and no recourse but to walk away. "This is insane," she said, passing the letter back. "Your claim was filed properly. I saw the documents. Filed, yes. But Hackett is arguing that the original writ clearing the land was specific to human settlement, and that allowing an orc," he paused, wincing, "allowing you to work on the property violates the terms. He is saying that because you have been helping me, the claim is compromised." Thorne went very still. "He is using me against you. He is grasping at straws. But yes." Lysander folded the letter and tucked it into his coat, his face grim. "I am not going to let him win this, Thorne, but it means more hearings, more delays. And I need to prove that the original writ does not prohibit orcs from living on the land, which means digging into records that are over 50 years old. Then we dig." Thorne set down the hammer she had been holding and untied her apron. "Where do we start?" They started with the village clerk, a stooped old man named Petrus, who kept the parish records in a room that smelled of mildew and ink. He was sympathetic to their cause but not particularly helpful, explaining that the original writ clearing Greenthorn had been issued by a regional magistrate, and the only copy on file was a summary, not the full document. "You would need to go to the county seat to see the original," Petrus said, peering at them over the rims of his spectacles. "It is a 2-day ride, and the record office is not known for being accommodating. But if you want the full text of the writ, that is where you will find it." Lysander and Thorne exchanged a look. 2 days there, 2 days back, and however long it takes to find the document, Lysander said. "I can be away from the house for that long, but I will lose time on finishing the work." "Then I will go alone," Thorne said. "I know what we are looking for, and I can copy the document if they will not let me take it. You should not have to do that. This is my problem." "It is our problem," she corrected. "Hackett made it that when he dragged me into it. Besides, you are better at carpentry than I am. Stay and finish the house. I will get the writ." She left the next morning, riding a sturdy cob borrowed from a neighbor and carrying enough supplies for a week in case the trip took longer than expected. The county seat was a bustling market town, larger and louder than anything Thorne was used to, and the record office was buried in the basement of the courthouse, a maze of shelves and filing boxes overseen by a clerk with the disposition of a disgruntled badger. It took her 3 days to find the writ, buried in a box marked with the wrong year and filed under a misspelled version of the magistrate's name. When she finally unearthed it, dust-covered and brittle with age, she sat down at the clerk's table and read it through twice to make sure she understood. The writ was just as Lysander had described, an order clearing the Greenthorn steading and relocating the Orc family who had lived there, with compensation provided in the form of property in the village. But there was no prohibition on Orcs returning to the land. The writ specified that the steading was to be held in common until claimed and improved, with no restrictions on who could make that claim. Thorne copied the relevant passages by hand, her fingers cramping around the pen, and paid the clerk for a certified copy to take back as proof. Then she rode home with the document tucked safely in her saddlebag, tired and sore but grimly satisfied. Lysander was on the roof when she arrived back at Greenthorn, nailing down the last of the shingles. He climbed down as soon as he saw her, his face lighting with relief. "You found it." "I found it." She handed him the certified copy, watching as he scanned the text. "There is no prohibition. Hackett has no case." He read it through, then looked up at her with an expression that was equal parts exhausted and hopeful. "This is it, then. If we present this at the appeal, he has to drop the complaint. He has to, but he will not like it." Thorne dismounted and stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her legs. "Men like Hackett do not give up easily, but at least we have the truth on our side." The appeal hearing was scheduled for late October, and Thorne spent the intervening weeks bracing for a fight. But when the day arrived, Hackett did not show. The reeve read out the writ Thorne had retrieved, declared the appeal without merit, and dismissed the case with a stern warning about wasting the court's time. Lysander's claim was upheld. Greenthorn was legally his, and no one could challenge it. They walked back to the steading in silence, the autumn afternoon cool and bright around them. The house stood finished now, every detail complete, from the ridge tiles on the roof to the iron latch on the door. Lysander had worked himself to exhaustion over the past month, determined to have everything ready, and it showed. The place gleamed with care, every board planed smooth, every stone set true. At the door he stopped and turned to Thorne. "I have something for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key, the lock she had forged for him nearly a year ago. It was iron, simple and functional, exactly as he had ordered. He held it out to her, and she took it automatically, confused. "I do not understand," she said. "This is your key." "It is your key," Lysander corrected. "I built this house, Thorne. I spent a year working on it, stone by stone and board by board, and every day I thought about what it would be for, who it would be for." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I built it for you if you want it, if you will stay." The words landed like a hammer blow, and Thorne stood frozen, the key heavy in her hand. She looked at the house, at Lysander, and felt 1,000 thoughts collide in her head at once. He had built this for her. Not just a house, but a home on land that had once belonged to her grandmother. He had spent a year of his life on it, alone, because he had not known how else to say what he wanted. "You built a house for me," she repeated, testing the words. "I know it is strange. I know I should have just asked, instead of doing this entire ridiculous thing. But I'm not good with words, and I thought," he broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I thought if I built something solid, something real, you would see that I mean it, that I want you here not just for today or tomorrow, but for as long as you will have me." Thorne looked at the key in her hand, then at Lysander's face, open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. She thought about the year that had passed, all the hours spent working side by side, the slow, patient way they had learned each other's rhythms. She thought about the stone with her grandmother's mark, still set in the hearth, a reminder of what had been lost and what could be built anew. And she thought about the way Lysander had never asked her to choose between her past and his future, had never demanded that she forget where she came from. He had just made space for her, in his house and in his life, and trusted that she would know what to do with it. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out steady and sure. "Yes, I will stay." The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. He reached for her, hesitated, and then she closed the distance herself, stepping into his arms and feeling them close around her with a certainty that felt like coming home. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other, and then Lysander pulled back just enough to look at her. "I love you," he said, and it was the simplest, most honest thing she had ever heard. "I think I have loved you since the day you climbed the hill to yell at me about ridge tiles." Thorne laughed, sudden and bright. "I love you too, even though you are terrible at measuring timber. I will get better. You had better. I am not spending the rest of my life fixing your mistakes." She kissed him then, slow and deliberate, and felt him smile against her mouth. When they finally broke apart, she looked down at the key still clutched in her hand. "So what now? Do I just move in, or is there some kind of ceremony involved?" "I was thinking we could start with dinner," Lysander said, "and then we can figure out the rest as we go." Dinner turned into a week, and a week turned into a month, and before Thorne quite realized what was happening, her belongings had migrated from the village forge to Greenthorn in a steady trickle of tools and clothes and small personal things. Her father came to visit one Sunday and stayed for supper, and if he had any objections to his daughter living with a man she was not married to, he kept them to himself. Mostly he just seemed relieved that Thorne was happy, and that Lysander had the good sense to treat her well. Winter came in cold and sharp, and Thorne spent her days at the forge in the village and her evenings at Greenthorn, learning the rhythms of the house Lysander had built. It was strange at first, sharing space with someone else, but they were both used to working alone, and it made them careful with each other, thoughtful in ways that smoothed over the rough edges of cohabitation. They talked, in those long winter evenings, about things they had never discussed before. Lysander told her about his childhood in Ashford Mill, the wheelwright father who had died when Lysander was 12. The years spent learning the trade and saving every spare coin toward a future that had always felt impossibly distant. Thorne told him about her grandmother, the stories her father had shared about the steading before the clearing, the quiet grief that had shaped her family without ever being named aloud. "I used to think I should be angrier about it," Thorne admitted one night, curled next to Lysander in front of the fire. "About losing Greenthorn, I mean. But my father was never angry, so I did not know how to be either. I just felt sad in this distant way, like mourning something I never really had." "And now?" Lysander asked. "Now I think maybe the best way to honor what was lost is to build something new on top of it." She looked around the room at the sturdy walls and the warm firelight and felt a bone-deep contentment settle over her. "You gave that to me. A way to come home without pretending the past did not happen." He kissed the top of her head, a gesture that had become familiar over the months. "Then I am glad I built the house, even if it did take me a year and nearly got me run out of the valley by a vindictive woodward." Spring came again, and with it a plan. Lysander had been thinking about adding a forge to the property, a small outbuilding attached to the house where Thorne could work without having to travel back and forth to the village every day. It made sense practically, but it also felt like a declaration, a way of saying that Greenthorn was as much hers as his. "We would need to register the addition," Thorne pointed out when he first raised the idea. "And that means filing with the Reeve again, which means dealing with more bureaucracy." "I know. But I also know that you have been talking about your father retiring, and he cannot do that as long as the village forge is the only option." Lysander spread out a rough sketch on the table, showing where he thought the forge could go. "If we build one here, you can take over the commissions and he can rest. It would solve a lot of problems." Thorne studied the sketch, her mind already racing ahead to the practicalities. A forge of her own, built to her specifications, with room for the tools and workspace she had always wanted. It was a dream she had not let herself consider before, but now that Lysander had named it, she could not imagine anything else. "All right," she said. "Let us do it. But this time I am handling all the paperwork. I do not trust you not to file something under the wrong name again." They broke ground on the forge in April, and this time the work went faster because they had help. Word had spread in the village about the house Lysander had built and the appeal he had won, and people were curious. Some came just to see the place, but others stayed to lend a hand, drawn by the novelty of an orc and a human building something together. It was not acceptance, not quite, but it was a start. Thorne's father came up one afternoon in early May, leaning heavily on his stick, but determined to see the progress for himself. He walked the bounds of the property, inspecting Lysander's work with the critical eye of a man who had spent his life building things. And then he sat down by the hearth and asked to see the stone with his mother's mark. Thorne brought it to him, and he held it in his hands for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he looked up at Lysander and said, "You did good work here, boy. My mother would have approved." It was the closest thing to a blessing Thorne had ever heard from her father, and she saw Lysander's throat work as he swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." The forge was finished by midsummer. A sturdy stone structure with a good chimney and a bellows Thorne had salvaged from an abandoned smithy 2 valleys over. She fired it for the first time on a bright July morning, with Lysander and her father and a handful of neighbors gathered to watch. The coals caught and glowed, and Thorne felt a fierce pride swell in her chest as she worked the bellows and the heat built. This was hers. Not inherited, not borrowed, but built with her own hands and Lysander's, a forge on land that had once been her grandmother's and was now hers again in a way that felt right. She made nails that first day, simple and practical, and gave them away to everyone who had helped with the building. It was a small thing, but it mattered. People left with iron in their pockets and stories to tell, and Thorne knew that those stories would spread, the way stories always did in small places. After everyone had gone, Lysander and Thorne stood in the yard, watching the last of the daylight fade into dusk. Her father had stayed for supper and then asked to remain, at least for a few days, because the journey back to the village was harder than it used to be and he was tired. "He can stay as long as he wants," Lysander had said, and meant it, and now the old man was asleep in the loft, his breathing easier than Thorne had heard it in months. "We should make this official," Lysander said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "The house, the forge, all of it. I want your name on the deed alongside mine." Thorne looked at him, surprised. "That is not necessary. You built this place." "We built this place," he corrected, "and I do not want there to be any question about who it belongs to. Not now, not ever." He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I want us to be partners in this, Thorne, in everything." She thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but if we are putting both names on the deed, then we should probably make the rest of it official too." "The rest of it?" "The part where we are living together and building a life and planning a future. People have words for that, you know." She gave him a teasing smile. "I believe the term is marriage." Lysander blinked, then laughed, the sound surprised and delighted. "Are you proposing to me?" "Someone has to, and you have already used up your grand gesture building me a house." She squeezed his hand. "What do you say, Lysander Pritchard? Will you marry me?" "Yes," he said, and pulled her into a kiss that tasted like smoke and summer and the promise of every year to come. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married in the village church on a cool September morning, exactly 1 year after Lysander had first climbed the hill to claim his lock. It was a small ceremony, just Thorne's father and a handful of friends, but it felt right. The priest stumbled over the vows a little, uncertain how to address a union between a human and an orc. But Lysander and Thorne spoke their promises clearly and without hesitation. And when it was done, they walked back to Greenthorn hand in hand, husband and wife. The celebration that followed was louder and more chaotic, a gathering of everyone who had helped with the house or the forge, or just wanted an excuse to drink and eat and gossip. Thorne's father had insisted on roasting a pig, and the smell of it filled the yard, drawing people from all over the valley. There was music and dancing, and at some point someone produced a fiddle, and Lysander, emboldened by ale and happiness, coaxed Thorne into a clumsy reel that left them both breathless and laughing. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Lysander stood up and called for quiet. He had something to say, he announced, and people settled into expectant silence, curious. "When I came to this valley a year ago, I did not know what I was looking for," he began, his voice carrying across the yard. "I just knew I wanted to build something of my own. A home, a future, a place to belong, and I found all of that, but not in the way I expected." He looked at Thorne, and his smile was soft and private just for her. "I found it because of the woman who climbed the hill to yell at me about ridge tiles, and who kept coming back even when she had every reason not to. I built this house for her, and she made it a home. And now, because she is generous and patient and far too good for me, she has agreed to share it." There was a murmur of approval from the crowd, and Lysander held up a hand for silence again. "But there is one more thing I want to do, to make sure there is no question about who this place belongs to. Thorne and I are going to register the holding under both our names, and we are asking the reeve to witness it. So tomorrow, anyone who wants to come and see the deed read aloud is welcome. We will be serving free nails." That got a laugh, and people cheered and toasted the newlyweds with whatever was closest to hand. Thorne felt her face heat, but she was smiling too, touched by the gesture and the public declaration that Greenthorn was as much hers as Lysander's. The next day, true to his word, Lysander invited the reeve and anyone else who wanted to witness the deed. Bertram arrived with his clerk in tow, looking bemused but willing, and a crowd gathered in the yard to watch as the document was read aloud. It listed Greenthorn as a joint holding, registered to Lysander Pritchard and Thorne Pritchett, with all rights and responsibilities shared equally. "This is unusual," Bertram remarked as he signed the document, "but not unheard of. And given the work you have both put into this place, I see no reason to object." He handed the deed to Thorne, and she accepted it with a sense of profound rightness. This was hers now, officially and legally, a piece of land that had been her grandmother's and was now hers again, claimed not through loss or exile but through love and partnership. After the deed was witnessed, people lingered to admire the forge and ask questions about the work Thorne planned to do. She answered patiently, explaining her plans to take over the village commissions and expand into specialty work, hinges and tools and decorative ironwork that there was a market for in the larger towns. Her father sat by the forge, nodding along, and when someone asked if he was sad to be retiring, he just smiled and said he was relieved. "My daughter is a better smith than I ever was," he said, his voice thin but proud. "She will do well here." As the weeks turned into months, Greenthorn settled into a comfortable routine. Thorne worked the forge during the day, and Lysander took on carpentry commissions from neighbors who had seen his work and wanted pieces of their own. In the evenings they cooked together, experimenting with recipes and laughing over burned bread and oversalted stew, learning the small domestic skills that neither of them had needed when they lived alone. Thorne's father stayed on, his health stabilizing in the clean air and quiet of the steading. He took over the garden, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil with the same patience he had once used at the forge, and he and Lysander developed an easy friendship, the kind built on shared work and mutual respect. Winter came again, and with it a deep contentment that settled over the household like snow. Thorne would come in from the forge at the end of the day, her hands smudged with soot, and find Lysander cooking dinner while her father dozed by the fire. It was ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of scene that played out in 1,000 homes across the valley, but it felt precious to her, this life they had built together. One evening in late January, as they sat by the fire after supper, Lysander reached over and took her hand. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the future. What about it? About what comes next? We have the house, the forge, the land, we have each other, and I keep wondering what else we might want." He hesitated, then added, "Children, maybe, if you want them." Thorne considered the question, turning it over in her mind. She had not thought much about children before, too focused on the forge and the work and the 100 small tasks that filled her days. But now, sitting in the warm house with Lysander's hand in hers and her father's gentle snoring in the background, she could imagine it. A child, or maybe two, growing up here with space to run and work to learn and parents who loved them. "I think I would like that," she said. "Not right away, maybe, but someday." "Someday," Lysander agreed and kissed her, sweet and slow. "I can work with someday." Spring returned, as it always did, and with it came the first signs that Thorne's someday was arriving sooner than expected. She realized she was pregnant in early April, and told Lysander one evening after her father had gone to bed. He stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through shock and joy and a flicker of panic. And then he laughed and picked her up and spun her around until she was dizzy and scolding him to put her down before he dropped her. "We are going to have a baby," he said, setting her carefully on her feet. "We are going to be parents." "We are," Thorne confirmed and felt a giddy rush of excitement mixed with terror. "I have no idea what I am doing." "Neither do I. We will figure it out together." He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "Just like everything else." They told her father the next morning, and he cried, which neither of them had been expecting. But they were good tears, he assured them, the kind that came from joy and relief and the knowledge that his family would continue. He insisted on carving a cradle, despite his shaking hands, and spent the summer working on it in the shade of the garden, sanding the wood until it was smooth as glass. Thorne worked the forge as long as she could, scaling back her commissions as her belly grew and the work became harder. Lysander fussed over her, worried she was pushing too hard, but she waved him off with good-natured exasperation. She was pregnant, not fragile, and she had no intention of sitting idle when there was work to be done. The baby came in late November, on a cold, clear night when the stars were bright enough to cast shadows. It was a long labor, difficult and exhausting, but Thorne had the village midwife and Lysander's steady presence to see her through. When it was over and the baby was cleaned and wrapped and placed in her arms, Thorne looked down at her daughter and felt her heart crack open with love. "She is perfect," Lysander whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand, and she gripped his finger with surprising strength. "What should we name her?" Thorne thought for a moment, then smiled. "Petra, after my grandmother. She would have liked that." "Petra," Lysander repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Petra Pritchard." They brought the baby to meet her grandfather the next morning, and he held her with trembling hands, his face soft with wonder. "She has your eyes, Thorne," he said, "and your stubbornness, I expect. God's help us all." "God's help her," Thorne said, laughing. "She is going to grow up with a blacksmith mother and a carpenter father. She will be insufferable." The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles, the kind that came with raising a baby. Petra was healthy and loud, with a temper that flared bright and fast, and a laugh that could light up a room. Thorne juggled the forge and motherhood with varying degrees of success, and Lysander took on more of the household work, cooking and cleaning and soothing the baby when Thorne was elbow-deep in a commission. Her father helped when he could, but his health was failing, the coughing sickness settling deeper into his lungs. He spent most of his days by the fire now, too weak to do much more than hold Petra and tell her stories about her great-grandmother, and the steading that had been and the forge that was. Thorne knew he was slipping away, and it hurt in a way she had not been prepared for, but she was grateful he had lived long enough to meet his granddaughter. He passed quietly one morning in early spring, with Thorne and Lysander at his side and Petra asleep in the cradle he had made. They buried him in the small plot behind the house, under a stone that Thorne carved with her own hands, and the village turned out to mourn a man who had been well loved and well respected. In the weeks after the funeral, Thorne threw herself into the forge, working through her grief the only way she knew how. Lysander let her, understanding that she needed the fire and the iron and the rhythm of the hammer to process what she had lost. But he was there when she came home at the end of the day, ready with dinner and a warm embrace and the knowledge that she did not have to carry the weight alone. Time passed, as it always did, and the sharp edges of grief softened into something more bearable. Petra grew, reaching and babbling and eventually taking her first wobbly steps across the floor of the forge while Thorne worked. She was a curious child, fearless and bright, and Thorne could see echoes of her father's patience and her own determination in the way Petra approached the world. By the time Petra was 2, Thorne was pregnant again, and this time the news was met with calm acceptance rather than surprise. They were ready, or as ready as anyone could be, And when the second baby arrived, a boy they named William, it felt like the family was complete. Life at Greenthorn settled into a new rhythm, shaped by the needs of two small children and the demands of the forge and the carpentry work that kept coming. It was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful, and Thorne would not have traded it for anything. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, Lysander turned to Thorne and said, "Do you ever regret it? Staying here, I mean, building this life?" She thought about the question, really thought about it, and then shook her head. "No, I have never regretted it." "Not once." "Good," he said, and took her hand. "Because I built this house for you, and I would do it again in a heartbeat." Thorne smiled, squeezing his fingers. "I know. And I would say yes again every time." They sat together as the light faded, their children asleep inside and the forge cold for the night, and Thorne felt a deep and abiding peace. This was home, built on old stones and new dreams, a place where the past and the future met and made something worth keeping. And it was hers, shared with the man who had spent a year building it alone and then handed her the key and asked her to stay. She had stayed. And she would keep staying for all the years to come, because this was where she belonged. With Lysander, with her children, with the forge and the house and the land that had come full circle back to her family. It was not the ending her grandmother would have imagined, but it was a good one all the same, and Thorne thought that maybe that was enough. The stars came out one by one, bright and steady in the darkening sky, and inside the house Petra began to cry, a sleepy, fussy sound that meant she wanted her mother. Thorne stood, stretching the kinks from her back, and Lysander rose with her. "I will get her," he said. "You stay and enjoy the quiet." But Thorne shook her head and followed him inside, because the quiet was nice but her family was nicer, and she had learned over the years that the best moments were the ones you did not try to hold on to but just lived, fully and without reservation. And so she did.